the relationship between music and literature, and actually Jonathan put on a kind of rock opera that he'd written there with a band called the High Llamas, so he was involved in it as well. But in my talk I discussed the parallel development of the symphonic and the novel form, which arose at the same time and acted both as vehicles for a certain kind of artistic self-exploration and exploration of the world. And I made the case, the argument that just as in classical music, the arrival of atonality, or the pushing of atonality by Schoenberg and by the Vienna School represented a massive break in the continuum of classical music. Really nothing was the same after it. It became impossible, except for quite minor composers, to carry on with the traditional symphonic forms. But the impact of modernist writers like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, or even arguably somebody like Robert Musil in Austria, Louis Ferdinand Céline in France, it hasn't been comparable on the novel. People have gone back to writing very traditional novels about traditional characters with traditional plots. If you speak to readers, what they love is a plot. They love the idea of a plot, and you know, they seem endlessly to take it for granted that life resolves itself often through coincidences. That, you know, happening to meet somebody quite by chance nonetheless, and then turning out to know somebody who you know will be the pivot upon which your life turns. Yeah, I've very seldom met anybody in the real world whose life has been determined by a coincidental happening. So, you know, I suppose what I was trying to say was that the novel, for some reason, if you like, I can explain at great length what I think those reasons are, and I think it's stronger in England than it is in continental Europe, has stuck with these traditional forms much more than music. That's all.
Well, tonal classical music has experienced a kind of resurgence in the last 30 or 40 years, I suppose. Starting maybe with the New York minimalists, with Steve Reich and Philip Glass and people like that.
Yeah, but it's shit, isn't it?
No, it's not shit. It's not shit at all, actually. Well, that still doesn't make him not shit, but...
well, Reich is better than Glass.
Yes, Philip Glass is not a good example, because I don't think he's a very good composer. But, you know, that has opened up the way to tonality again in the concert halls. And, you know, I think there is a sense, I'm trying to phrase this without sounding too reactionary, that what Schoenberg and Berg and Webern did at the time has been seen as a kind of artistic cul-de-sac and a necessary logical development of where the Western classical tradition was going, but not one that opened doors for future generations. And I would argue, in a way, that the same is true of what Joyce did. Now I know you're a great Joycean, and that the novel you've just published, Umbrella, is in many ways inspired by a response to a continuation of Ulysses, and it's a very, very important novel because it has made a significant difference to literary culture in Britain this year. This is a novel which was shortlisted for our most prestigious literary prize, the Booker Prize, which very nearly won that prize, which many people think should have won that prize. And yet it's written in an uncompromising modernist idiom, a high modernist Joycean idiom, which you know, has no mainstream writer, because you are a mainstream writer, a writer with a big following, no mainstream writer has really attempted in the last 60 or 70 or 80 years. I still think, however, that what Joyce went on to do after Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, is like the most uncompromising 12-tone works of the Western classical composers, is a cul-de-sac that is extraordinary in itself, but could not possibly lead anywhere.
Let's go outside and nude mud wrestle to decide this question.
Let's do it right here, if you like, Will.
Yes, I mean, Finnegan's Wake is pretty much unreadable, let's face it. I mean, it's interesting that Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce kind of is readable if you're completely polyglot. I mean, if you do speak Danish, Italian, French, probably a bit of Romanian in there.
20 words.
20 words of Romanian, thank you, Bogdan. Did you have to wade through a lot of Finnegan's Wake in order to extract those 20 words? Yeah, it's not your work. I knew there would be Romanian in there because that's the kind of inclusionist Joyce was, and of course he lived in Trieste, and he would have known Romanians and so on and so forth. So the strange thing about Finnegan's Wake, in a way, is that it's a kind of novel that points away towards an impossible person other than Joyce. So, you know,
who also said that it took him 17 years to write, and that the least a reader could do would be to spend 17 years reading it.
Yes.
Which he meant, I think.
Yes, and I think, you know, while I admire the kind of certain aspects of modernism, I have to say that the reason why I adopted certain modernist techniques was not an homage to Joyce, was not an exercise in intertextuality, was not through any kind of literary programmatic reason at all. It was purely emotional. It was purely an emotional response to the very doubt you raised in the first place, which was that I felt I could no longer say he went to Bucharest with any conviction. I couldn't believe in the impersonal narrator that was saying it, and I couldn't believe in the simple past that sentence describes. That I could no longer adequately convey experience. I think the critique of stream of consciousness and continuous present writing, I feel the force of it quite strongly, which is what conventional literary styles can do in an odd kind of way, and Jonathan shows this very well in his last published novel, The Terrible Privacy of Maxwell's Sim, the last one to be published in English, is even in a very straightforward, you know, kind of almost forensic prose, you can more or less say everything you want to say about people's mental states. You can objectively describe them. You know, so maybe modernism in that sense, or modernist literary techniques, both in music and modernist musical techniques, can be viewed as a sort of cul-de-sac if they're taken only to be a formalist tool. They're just approached formalist. But if they're approached emotionally, then surely they will be evolving in some way all the time. That's all. I think Joyce was a victim, rather like the Ulipoul writers in France, which I know that they have their great enthusiasts, but what they're doing often seems to me to be not releasing imaginative potential through the constraint of enforced mathematical problematics and for the way they construct things, but just playing games.
Yeah, I think a fence has been erected partly by writers, partly by the practitioners themselves, also by critics and ideologues and adherents and so on, between formal experimentation, if you want to call it that, on the one hand, and emotionality on the other, and the assumption, certainly among readers, maybe among a fair number of writers as well, is that the two are somehow incompatible. And I think Joyce disproves that, because Ulysses is a tremendously emotionally engaging book. I think B.S. Johnson, who I wrote my biography of, disproves that, because his novels are highly formally experimental, but at the same time extremely accessible, full of feeling, full of kind of autobiographical nakedness. And I think Umbrella proves that, because you know, it's a novel that you approach with a certain amount of trepidation, because it carries a kind of waft of its own uncompromising fearsomeness in front of it. But actually, when you relax into the rhythms of that prose, what you feel, I think, is a writer kind of discovering his authentic voice, a voice that you've been kind of working your way towards for the last 15 or 20 years.